Thanks all for coming. I think we have a little clip that we're going to start out with. Can we cue that up, please?
There are a total of 13 stab wounds which have penetrated the body. They are all arbitrarily numbered from 1 to 13. There are 8 wounds noted in the left side and upper back in the shoulder and scapular area, where wound number 1 is on the top of the left shoulder.
I'm sitting in the office of a man who prosecutes murders for a living. His name is Matt Murphy. He's a veteran assistant district attorney who handles homicides out of Newport Beach, California. If you're from somewhere else and have a mental picture of Orange County, about an hour south of LA, Newport Beach is probably part of that image. It's the side of the county that the tourist guides want you to see. Pacific Coast Highway runs through it, luxury shopping, piers and surf shops and plastic surgeons, yachts and cliffside mansions. I used to cover the city as a crime reporter for a local newspaper. There weren't a lot of murders, maybe 1 a year, 2 or 3 in a very bad year. Greed or lust figured prominently in the most memorable ones. These days, if you're one of the rare people who meet a violent death in Newport Beach, Matt Murphy is the prosecutor who will hear about it. The homicide case that landed on his desk in the summer of 2016 was particularly violent, and it was unique in his experience.
Number 5 is on the left, more to the upper arm area. Numbers 6, 7, and 8 are close to the midline region of the upper back. All of these stab wounds are superficial wounds. They have all been sutured by metallic staple sutures.
Murphy is reading the autopsy report, which is part of how he assesses whether there's a prosecutable offense. A homicide is the killing of one human being by another. He had to decide whether it was a crime.
Wound number 13, which is the fatal wound, is the upper left eyelid, 1 centimeter in size. Only wound number 9 has some bruising around it, and another bruise noted around 12 and 13. So when you review something like this, what it tells you is this young woman fought like hell.
Okay, that's the first few minutes of Dirty John, the first episode of 6. The title of my talk is 10 Things I Learned from My First Podcast. So first, a little bit about my background. I've spent most of my 22-year career at daily newspapers. The Daily Pilot, a small community newspaper in Southern California, then the St. Petersburg Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times, of course. And for the last 12 years or so, I've been at the Los Angeles Times, which is my hometown newspaper. And I think I've published more than 2,000 stories and articles, hard news, soft news, features, profiles, and everything in between. Some won awards, some helped put people behind bars, some I turned into books. Some of them mattered, but most of them not so much. They were forgotten as soon as they landed on the front porch because the vast majority of them did just what they were supposed to do, which is to give readers the news of the day, which by definition is a transient phenomenon. So the written word to me is still the height of technology. You can flip forward and backward, you can linger over a line, you can open a story anywhere and lose yourself. It's an unmediated connection between reader and writer. And the written word requires active participation on the reader's part, concentration, which I think is a good thing. So here is the irony. Dirty John is my first podcast, my one and only podcast, and it's received vastly more attention than any of my stories. This has surprised no one more than me, because before now I never thought of myself as a podcaster, and before now a written story seemed to me the be-all and the end-all. So, what are the lessons? Lesson 1, if you want to do it, your barrier to entry is pretty low. Here's how it came together. In August 2016, a sharp-eyed reporter for the Daily Pilot named Hannah Fry spotted a line on a coroner's website about a homicide and broke the story of the death of John Meehan and did some digging that suggested he had a dark past. A good number of the people that I spoke to as my reporting got underway told me, "This is the scariest man I have ever met." Some of those were veteran lawyers and cops. It was interesting to listen to Jeff Gwynne a little while ago talk about Jim Jones and Charles Manson, because this guy, John Meehan, bore some resemblance to those guys in terms of their manipulativeness and their tactic of isolating people, the better to control them. So this is John Meehan. Around March, I turned in a 2-part story called Dirty John's Last Con, and about 5,000 words, and the editor said, this would be a great podcast if you can get some of these people on tape. Do you want to do it? Can you host it? Can you expand it to 6 parts? So I said, why not? And I jumped in with a combination of hubris and cluelessness, which is really my only superpower. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing, but as a reporter, you're comfortable being clueless about something you urgently need to learn in record time. Your stock and trade is knowing how to ask questions that other people might consider too dumb to ask. I've been a notebook and pen guy my entire career. I didn't even know what equipment I needed. I knew nothing about the physics of sound, that padded walls will absorb the sound waves and glass walls will reflect the sound back. I got permission to buy a mic, and I got the wrong mic a couple of times. I went to Guitar Center, I bought one that said for podcasting, but it's the kind of podcasting where you sit around a table and talk, not the type where you go into the field and do interviews. It turns out there are different kinds of microphones. Over the summer, the Times brought in a podcast network, Wondery, and Wondery brought in Karen Lowe, an NPR veteran producer, and she steered me toward the Rode NTG2 shotgun condenser microphone, which was the one I got. She taught me some audio capture tricks. You can take off your shoe and put it on the table and stick the mic in the shoe aimed at the person you're interviewing. I also learned that when you walk into a room and record, you need to make sure the AC is off, and you may need to unplug the fridge, things like that. That never would have occurred to me before. I got the Tascam DR40 recorder that the mic plugs into. I got headphones and a microphone cover. The microphone cover is called a dead cat. It essentially it blocks the wind. And I got a stand. That's the basic equipment you need, and it's $1,000. For $1,000, you can get into the game. The much bigger investment is time. You are going to need to transcribe and timestamp these interviews so you can tell the audio engineer what to pull. And if you want to edit the audio yourself, of course, there are programs like Hindenburg and a number of others that you can use, and a lot of freelance people use. We had a $1,000 transcription budget, which I blew through very fast. The transcription service is $70 per hour of conversation, and so I transcribed many hours on my own. I did the podcast at a breakneck pace in 3.5 months from June to October. I wrote 50,000 words of scripts, 5 hours worth across 6 episodes, and we recorded them at Wondery's studio on Sunset Boulevard. And then as the episodes were being assembled and edited, I wrote the Time series in a 2 or 3 week blur using the podcast scripts as the template. So this came together in a very unusual way. I wrote the podcast first, and that was the basis actually for the printed story. And for a while in the thick of it, I was living off coffee and NyQuil. I learned that caffeine comes in gum form. My health went to hell. I lost weight. I got pale and gaunt. This type of work will erode your health. It will imperil your friendships and your relationships. The only thing worse is when it's over. Lesson 2. In the overcrowded, hyper-competitive arena of podcasting, your reporting skills are mostly transferable and afford major advantages. This one is for the reporters in the room who are wondering, what would I bring to a podcast? And by the way, our keynote speaker on Friday night, I think, had it right when she said, podcasts are basically old-time radio in new garb. I grew up listening to old-time radio. I was a big fan of them. And podcasts, I think of as a new version of them. Some of you are working for small newspapers where, if your experience is anything like mine, you are writing 2 or 3 stories a day, every day. And as I mentioned, community news is where I got my start. At the Daily Pilot, no story was too small. In 1 week, I might do a story about a dog that needed adopting, a sandcastle building competition, a murder, a city council meeting, a water district board election, or a story about how it rained. weather stories. Once I did a story about how the goals had been stolen from the high school field hockey team. And then I did a dutiful follow-up when it turned out it was all a mistake. The maintenance crew had them. Community journalism. I did the cops log, so I would run to the local police departments. It was the Newport Beach and Costa Mesa PDs. And I would write down variations on cell phones stolen from a car in the 2500 block of Harbor Boulevard. And we did profiles called Pilot People, where you basically went through the phone book and cold called the local tattoo artist or Taekwondo instructor and said, tell me about yourself. Why does this matter? Emile Zola said, one style is forged on the terrible anvil of daily deadlines. And the great thing about working at that pace is you learn to write fast and clean. You learn the nuts and bolts of reporting. You learn how easy it is to misspell a name if you don't double check. You learn how to read a police report and how to find a court file, how to file a public records request, how to find a house in the woods and knock on the door, how to talk to someone respectfully who's just lost a brother or a sister or a parent, how to win the trust of complete strangers who have no rational reason to trust you, and then honor that trust. These are not skills you pick up overnight, and the country's best journalism programs are not going to give you more than the basics. And I don't think these are skills most podcasters have. Apple Podcasts now has something like 500,000 podcasts, one for any obsession or passing interest. A lot of them are people sitting around a microphone and riffing about sports or politics or movies or music or reality TV or the crime of the day. So, how is yours going to break through? What's different about Dirty John is that it's a reported podcast. It's built on reporting skills, fact-checking skills, and interviewing skills, and digging skills that took me 22 years to acquire, and that many of you are already expert at. Don't underestimate this advantage. Lesson number 3. Lesson number 3. You will grapple with ethical dilemmas unique to the podcast medium. So Dirty John was the LA Times' first really ambitious podcast, and it was an experiment. It was our first partnership with Wondery, which is an entertainment company. And their culture was not always in harmony with our culture, and we had to learn as we went along. One question that came up early was, this is first and foremost a work of journalism, so are we going to permit sound effects? Wondery shows aim for a sense of immersion, and they use music and sound effects extremely liberally to do so. The song we used is Devil's Got Your Boyfriend by Tracy Bonham, which has those wicked careening fiddles, which I loved, and I think that's mostly an aesthetic choice. When it comes to other types of sound effects that you may or may not use, I think it becomes an ethical choice. For example, in episode 1, I described the Balboa Island house where John Meehan and Deborah Newell move in together after a whirlwind courtship. It's right on the water, and I went out there with my shotgun mic and my dead cat and climbed onto the sand, and I leaned right over the water until my nose almost touched the foam and tried to catch the sound of the gently lapping Balboa Island waves. But the wind from the Pacific distorted the sound, and it was deemed unusable. So one of the producers or sound engineers said, well, we have beautiful samples of gently lapping waves in our database of sound effects. Who will ever know or care that they're not literally the gently lapping waves of Balboa Island? So I am curious, can I see by a show of hands, how many of the people in this room would endorse that view, that a canned sound effect of a platonically perfect wave is ethically permissible in a podcast that bills itself as journalism? We got at least a couple, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay. The argument for using the non-literal sound effect wave would be, look, this would just be the audio equivalent of a stock photo. It would be like showing a photo of a catcher's mitt in a story about baseball. or a photo of the New York skyline in a story about urban planning. And so an editor said, well, podcasting is a different medium. Audio rules aren't quite newspaper rules, so okay, let's try it. But then came other opportunities for sound effects. For instance, the restaurant where John and Deborah meet. I had recorded some audio from the actual restaurant, but it had not impressed anyone. And so the engineer layered in some clinking silverware and ambient chatter that they got from the effects database. It sounded more like a restaurant than the actual restaurant. So my nervousness is growing. When I talk about John Meehan's childhood in a casino, they put in a cool effect of a roulette wheel to suggest the atmosphere. And when John Meehan goes to the hospital, they put in an effect of doctors being paged, so you feel like you're there. And by now it was clear to me that we should not have opened this door. In episode 6, finally, we deal with the confrontation on a rooftop garage in which the knife falls from John Meehan's hand and clatters to the pavement. And of course, we have no audio of the actual event, but the database supplies a super dramatic knife clattering to pavement effect. So I get the rough cut and play it for my editors, and now we are all in agreement. At this point, we said, we cannot do this. This is the era of so-called fake news. We can't permit anyone to question the veracity of our work, so I told Wondery we have to go through every episode and strip out every effect. The waves have to go, the roulette wheel has to go, the knife, everything. And they said, understood, done. And that's the way it aired. So it was a learning experience for them too. They learned, Wondery did, about the sort of things that newspapers worry about, which are not necessarily self-evident to outsiders. Lesson number 4. You have been mispronouncing Nevada your whole life. This is a lesson I learned painfully from our NPR veteran producer. It turns out that it's not Nevada. You may be mangling other words, and you will not know until you have to say them aloud in a Sunset Boulevard studio and wonder why people are snickering at you. You may have some other bad habits. I know I did. Some of my interviews were unusable because I said, or even worse, because I could be heard typing as I was conducting it over the phone for fear the recorder wasn't working. And I learned to record interviews over the phone. There are a number of apps that you can use to do that. Lesson number 5, your podcast can reach more people than your print stories will, though with luck, people will be drawn to your newspaper and its website to read the stories too, become absorbed in the other work your paper does, subscribe, get smarter, and save democracy. One of the reasons podcasts are so popular is that they're easy to take in. Reading takes concentration. You need to carve out distraction-free time and pay attention. Podcasts, on the other hand, are a multitasker's dream. You can binge listen while you're shoveling snow out of your driveway on a cold New England morning, or sweating on the elliptical, or baling your hay, or sitting in your windowless cubicle pretending to cold call Taekwondo teachers for the profile you're writing. Some 40% of Americans have now heard a podcast. We launched the podcast simultaneously with the written series. The idea was cross-fertilization. The series would drive people to the podcast, maybe for the first time, drive people to a podcast, I should say, maybe for the first time. And the podcast would drive people to the stories on the website and maybe introduce them to some of the other journalism that we do. And with luck, people would subscribe and start getting their news from sources more reliable than Facebook or Reddit or the Kremlin. And that would promote the cause of news literacy, because we are facing a crisis of credibility. After all, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll, just 48% of people have confidence in journalists. By the way, only 51% believe vaccines are safe, and 47% believe in haunted houses. Can half the country that doesn't trust us be reclaimed? Is it a good idea to write them off as unreachable? I think the only way you can even begin to win the argument is by getting people, by hook or by crook, to start reading the paper. I don't think podcasting is going to save American newspapers. I don't think that serial narratives, which is the other thing I do a lot of, are going to save us either, but I do think that they are potentially a couple of great weapons in a much larger armory. Lesson number 6, you need to be aware of the cat. As a print reporter, you don't have to think about the cats and the dogs or other animals in the room where you're doing your interview, except to worry about whether they will activate your allergies. The first time I interviewed Tara Newell at her apartment on tape, I asked her to please put her cat in the other room. I am allergic. We talked, and we were about an hour in, and we were slowly building to the most sensitive part of the interview, where I had to ask her to describe how John Meehan attacked her. This is an emotionally raw experience for her, and she is getting choked up. She's talking about grabbing the knife and killing him. And just then, her cat loses its mind. It starts mewling and bleating and moaning through the door, as if it senses her distress in reliving this moment. I didn't realize how bad it sounded until I played the audio, and the producer said, "This is the most important part of the tape, and it's pretty much unusable." So what do? You can minimize the cat sounds in the studio. You can try to, but you can't eliminate them altogether. You can preempt the listener's questions and tell them, you're about to hear a cat, try to ignore it. Or you can ask her to redo it. And that's what I did. I explained that I was a total amateur, learning as I go along, and could we please redo the whole thing? And we did it all over. Lesson number 7. Lesson number 7. It doesn't have to be about you, as fascinating as you believe yourself to be. S-Town and Serial, the really ambitious podcasts everyone talks about and wants to emulate, are very much about the hosts, Brian Reed and Sarah Koenig, respectively. I like them both. The hosts are characters in it. They're central to the story. You're on this journey with them. Their sleuthing is the spine of it. You get their reactions to every turn of the story, and they are surrogates for the audience. They are path breakers, and they have engendered many pale imitations. The idea with Dirty John was to marry the rigors of real narrative journalism reporting to the radio serial format. And one thing I wanted to prove was that this particular story could be told without turning me as writer and host into a character. I wanted to do it the way I've always written my newspaper stories, which is by staying out of it and letting the people it's actually about do the talking. It's constructed as a story in the classic sense with a beginning, middle, and end. It has scenes. It has characters facing choices and conflicts and danger, and in that crucible, they change. I wanted to do something kind of in the tradition of In Cold Blood or the classic Gay Talese stories I grew up with, or The Staircase, the documentary series about the murder case, where the filmmakers are basically invisible or give the illusion that they're invisible, though they're pointing the camera and controlling everything you see and hear. So maybe in the next podcast I'll be more of a character. Maybe my presence will feel organic. But here I'm basically a window pane through which people can see the events unfold. You may have heard the Onion's stellar podcast, A Very Fatal Murder, which is a masterpiece. If you haven't, this is about a New York reporter investigating a murder in a small town. He likes to talk about how he went to NYU and tells the dead girl's parents how much she would have liked it too. Some people have told me the Onion is making fun of me too, here and there. I don't really believe it, but if it's even 5% true, I'm flattered. Lesson number 8. You have to earn people's attention, but you don't have to surrender basic journalistic principles to do so. So the word entertainment doesn't necessarily have great connotations. Some people equate it with dumbed-down journalism, with charticles and listicles and GIFs, or lowest common denominator, titillation and exploitation. I think there's a tacit assumption among a lot of people in this business, or some at least, that to be legitimate, a piece of journalism has to be a little boring, at least a little bit of a slog. They equate gravitas and seriousness of purpose with tediousness somehow. It doesn't feel properly ennobling unless you have to suffer to get through it. In unguarded moments, they will say, I like the story a lot, I couldn't put it down, but doesn't that make it entertainment rather than journalism? I remember a Washington Post reporter talking about a conversation with one of her editors who told her, you've buried important data findings beneath a lot of pretty writing. To my mind, the dichotomy between entertainment and journalism is a false one. It's not a binary choice. It all depends on what kind of entertainment you're talking about. I submit that even in hardcore investigative pieces, good writing can invest you in the human impact of the findings way more than a series of bullet points might. My hope is that Dirty John is a public service. It tells a story about domestic abuse, and it lays bare the wiles and stratagems of a sociopath on a granular level. It demonstrates how it is possible to fall prey to a malevolent creature like John Meehan and how it can destroy a family. It portrays the phenomenon of coercive control, which is a subset of domestic abuse that doesn't necessarily involve violence but involves intimidation, isolation, gaslighting, which are lies made to make you feel insane, and micro-regulation of a victim's day-to-day life. The abusers will install keystroke loggers on your computer to monitor every email you send. They may hide your phone or tell you how to fold the towels or iron the socks. They go on social media and pretend to be you and ruin your reputation. Now, you can write an ordinary feature about coercive control and furnish it with illustrative anecdotes, and it may be a fine and worthy story. Or you can try to go deeply into one family's experience with a compelling narrative and try to tell it from the inside of that experience and bring it alive. And the lesson, I think, will be immeasurably more powerful. So, the series I did depicts domestic abuse in a way that doesn't punish you with statistics and the disembodied pontificating of a lot of experts. It does so in a way that I hope does not bore you to tears with the weight of its importance. Here's the thing, there are now endless entertainment and information and infotainment options competing for your finite attention. Some of you are college professors with captive groups of helpless students, and you can force them to read The Fairy Queen or the collected works of Thorstein Veblen. But in most contexts, you can't make people read what you want them to read or listen to what you want them to listen to just by telling them it's good for them. That is often the tacit pitch made by big important newspapers, by the way. Read this 30,000-word series because it's good for you. You feel guilty and you have to pretend to have read it to fake your way through the water cooler conversation. But you don't want people to read your story and listen to your podcast because they feel guilty if they don't. You want them to love it so much they commend it to everyone they know. You have to earn people's attention. Lesson number 9. You are not going to be murdered if you fail. There was skepticism among editors and producers about whether I could make the transition from print to podcasting. They said, Goffard, have you ever written for radio before? I said no, but I didn't write a book until I did either. My motto is your comfort zone will kill you. Your comfort zone is your coffin. If I'm not terrified of what I'm doing, terrified that I'm going to fail miserably because I'm way out of my depth, that doesn't seem worth doing. If you're not failing at some things, you're not trying enough things. And every time you succeed, your circle of possibility expands a little bit. I'm always trying to lash against the outward edge of my talent. It's only worth doing if catastrophe seems a real option. Some of the sentences in Dirty John are 40 words long, which I was advised not to do because it's not conversational. That's the orthodoxy now. You're supposed to be telling a story to a friend over a cup of coffee. You're not supposed to use big words and cultural references that aren't instantly grasped by everyone. And I tried to push back against that a little bit, because why does a 16-year-old's frame of reference have to determine what I put in? Why must I pander to the least culturally curious listener in America? So I snuck in a few long sentences and some references to Don Draper and Citizen Kane, and if listeners don't know what Mad Men or Rosebud are, they can look them up. It would have been very easy for me to say I can't write a podcast, I'll leave it to the experts, but if you take a chance, you might be able to get away with some things, and if you get very lucky, The Onion will do a satire of your work and you will feel that you have arrived. Lesson 10, it's all about the story now and always. It's all about the story now and always. This is the real reason Dirty John found an audience. Please note, I didn't say it's all about the content. I don't know when this bloodless and depressing phrase started taking over the world, but I never liked it. I don't care if people call me a reporter or a journalist or a newsman or an ink-stained wretch, but I bristle at the label content provider or content creator. These are cringe-inducing phrases that make writers feel like assembly line workers at a dog food plant squeezing glop into a tin can. As a kid, I idolized Ernest Hemingway. I didn't say I want to grow up to be just like that hard-living, two-fisted, bullfighting content provider. It's like telling the person you love, let's get married and make some little carbon-based life forms. The Sudoku puzzle is, there's more. The Sudoku puzzle is called content, and the daily horoscope, and the item on ways to braise your pork. But so is my colleagues' reporting on the victims of the Las Vegas massacre, or the Montesino mudslides, or the stories from Syria that reporters on our foreign desk risk their lives to get, or my colleague David Willman's investigation into how the Pentagon paid Boeing $2 billion in bonuses for a missile defense system that doesn't work, a story that the Los Angeles Times had to sue the Department of Defense to get, or my colleagues' jaw-dropping revelations about what's been going on at USC, which are still coming out, or any of the important work done by 1,000 reporters around the country every day. To lump it all under the term content is akin to what they say in Hollywood, where they describe books and stories as IP, which is short for intellectual property. A commodity, like cattle stocks, that salesmen can make a buck on. So writers are just interchangeable IP purveyors. The mindless pervasiveness of the phrase content is, to my mind, symptomatic of a basic devaluing of what writers and reporters do. It conflates Woodward and Bernstein with the wordy-gurdy. It puts a tweet on the same plane as the sound and the fury. Why am I cranky about this? Some of you may have followed the fortunes of my newspaper over the last few years, under the heel of a charming company that was going to cut a third of the staff and shutter the DC bureau and bring in a shadow staff in LA and implement a bizarre plan where creatures called vertical micro-niche entrepreneur contributors would supplant actual reporters and turn out a lot of clickbait. This would have destroyed us as a newspaper. But that sort of corporate thinking is only possible when the newspaper is basically conceived of as a content receptacle, like a can of Purina puppy chow that the faceless employee drones are there to fill. By the way, we're in a better place now with a new owner, thanks in no small part to our new union. Bottom line, everything you see in Dirty John is an extension of what I've been doing at newspapers around the country for 22 years, which is learning to report and tell true stories. So I'd like to finish, I'm running way short on time here. I'd like to finish by reading from an introduction I wrote to a collection of 15 of my stories that's coming out in November. It's called Dirty John and Other True Stories of Outlaws and Outsiders. which will coincide with the release of a scripted TV show on Bravo, and which I don't think a publisher would be taking a risk on if not for the podcast. It's just a few graphs I'd like to read you that encapsulate my basic philosophy. When I interview people, I try to make myself small, colorless, forgettable, the better to channel them. The pronoun I makes no appearance in my stories. My interests are subordinated in the service of others' stories. This is, of course, a kind of illusion in the same way no documentary film captures objective reality. Every angle and every scene is a choice, a function of the artist's special obsessions. These stories are an oblique map of my own. I call them stories because they are not articles, which is what newspapers are known for. Articles are built to convey information, and they serve their purpose if they make you a little smarter about the world, or embarrass people into doing their jobs, or nudge crooks into jail, or make your elevator conversation less empty. They depend on the professionalism of reporters who pester and cajole and browbeat their sources, who track rumors to their origin and triple-check the spellings, who sometimes risk assault and abduction and murder. Articles are the miracle of daily newspapers, without which the froth-speckled cadres of the punditocracy, who are too busy to do much actual reporting, would be helplessly lost. They are why reporters are among the first people dictators line up against the wall. But articles don't care if you read them all the way through. They are resilient. They can be amputated at the knees and survive. They are designed that way with the important stuff at the top. They don't work on mystery. They are meant to dispel it as soon as possible. A story is a different life form. A story is an experience. Like a movie or a song or a poem, the good ones allow you to live inside other people's skulls for a little while and to touch the quick of their terror and grief and longing. Stories care about textures, about the coldness of the jail floor, not just about the charges that put you there. They care about the courtroom smell that won't come out of your suits, not just about the verdict. If they work, they augment our reservoirs of empathy and make us a little less lonely in our skin and provide a frisson of recognition that is akin to telepathy. Stories insist you finish them and hold you in a headlock until you do. They do this not by relying on pretty packaging or digital razzmatazz or fake gravitas or appeals to good citizen guilt, but because they withhold their mysteries, which means they don't make sense until you finish them, and the last paragraph, even the last line, is often the most important. The nitty-gritty is not promiscuously surrendered, but cunningly withheld and deviously parceled out. Every barroom raconteur knows this instinctively, but it's easy to forget working in newsrooms where we're trained to use the inverted pyramid, the 5 W's at the top, and to deploy nut graphs, which is, of course, the section meant to encapsulate in a tidy acorn shell why the piece is relevant and worthy of a reader's time. Maybe it was reading Tom French's Angels and Demons or Tom Wolfe's The New Journalism or Gay Talese's Fame and Obscurity, but I began to perceive that it is possible to write stories that are true in every particular, but partake of a novel's intimacy and immersiveness by borrowing some of its techniques, like scene-by-scene construction, point of view, and dialogue. I began dodging inverted pyramids and scuttling nut graphs, implicitly daring my editors to stop me. And I was lucky. I worked at papers with rosters of narrative risk-takers like French and Rick Bragg, Ann Hull and David Finkel, Barry Barak and Barry Siegel, Bella Stumbo and J.R. Moringer. These stories involve nobody famous. They do not focus on policymakers and celebrities. They do not rely on news hooks or care much about sweep. They are not polemics. They do not pound the table or raise a tin cup for a cause or aim to repair your flawed politics, though I hope they give some pain to ideologues. They are about criminals and their victims, about people in the coils of faceless systems and their own obsessions, about the falsely accused and the born trapped, about outsiders and the forms their desperation takes. They are sorties into the private psychic territory more commonly associated with fiction. A pair of runaway kids huddled together against the onrush of adulthood. A Marine haunted by his father's desertion from World War II. a mother who must leave her children to save them, an exile seeking redemption in a bus to the sea, a brave soldier whose memory has warped and twisted into a bludgeon to torture him, a lonely man enthralled to a childhood picture, building a boat to oblivion, a woman seeking love who finds a predatory creature expert at its mimicry. If you're familiar with that last one, which is the title story of this collection, it may be from the podcast I made or the TV series it inspired. A writer who claims to dislike unexpected attention is probably a lying writer. In this case, I'm mainly glad it brought you here. Thank you. We got, how much time do we have?
We're good. We'll take a few questions.
All right.
Any questions?
Chris?
Oh, sir.
All right.
The podcasting has got him on radio time, so we got a question.
Sure. Chris, well, two parts. When you're doing serial narratives, what are you looking at and can see in a story that's like that? There's something more that I can expand over several parts, and then particularly for, what do you say or do to people, because that's such an investment of their time over a long period of time, so many interviews, to get them to be on board where it's not just like one interview, I'm in and out, which they may be, so many people may be used to for other stories.
Yeah, it's a fundamentally different sort of reporting than you're doing on deadline. For years and years, I would have to run out to a crime scene or knock on the door of somebody who had just lost a family member and sit in their living room and get a quote or two and have to run back to the office and write it all up in an hour or two on a very tight deadline, and you become accustomed to that sort of rhythm and that sort of pace. And to do a story to do the sort of interviewing that lends itself to narratives, I think you have to put your notebook away for the first time that you're sitting down with them, and you have to build a rapport. It's a real investment of time. It's uncomfortable at times because you're looking for some results that may not come for weeks and weeks or maybe months. Does that answer your question? It's about readjusting your expectations for interviews and approaching them in a different way, so that the first interview, frequently I go out and I might not even take notes. I'll just get to know the person and explain patiently what it is that I'm doing. And I think one of the panelists earlier today said it very well when he said, look, help me understand. That is a question that will often get you in the door, get people to pick up the phone.
Hi, Chris. Cindy Carcamo here, your colleague at the Los Angeles Times. Great storytelling, beautiful storytelling. I was wondering if you could maybe explain a bit about how you came about to the story and perhaps Hannah Fry's role. Thank you.
Of course. Yes, Hannah Fry is a terrific reporter for the Daily Pilot newspaper, which is a small community newspaper in Newport Beach, Costa Mesa. I actually had the job, I think that she has, which is a cop reporter's job, covering 2 or 3 stories a day. She broke the story. She was, as I said in the talk, she was looking at a coroner's website, and she found the homicide, a homicide that she decided to make some calls about. The Newport Beach Police Department, to my frustration over many years, is not always terrific about letting people know about what's happening in the community. So there were a lot of 911 calls. The stabbing took place in broad daylight. There were many, many witnesses. There were many 911 calls. And when an Orange County Register reporter called that day, I think soon after this happened, and said, is anything going on? The dispatcher said, got nothing for you, which happened to me many, many times when I was covering that exact law enforcement agency. What happened is he didn't die for 4 days, John Meehan. He was stabbed through the eye. The knife went into his brain, and he lingered for 4 days before they pulled the plug, at which point the death makes the coroner's website, and Hannah, to her tremendous credit, spotted it there. She also did some digging that suggested this guy had a very sinister background. And she's credited as a contributor both in the series and on the podcast. Ben.
Chris,
Ben
do you
Montgomery.
feel the pressure to prove to your bosses the value of what you do, which is by nature an expensive, big undertaking? And did that change with the success of Dirty John?
I felt that pressure tremendously early in my career when I was trying to convince editors to give me the time to do them. I was very lucky. I worked at the St. Petersburg Times, and I had editors who had been doing these sort of stories for years. In fact, one of the best editors in the country is right over there, Mike Wilson, who edited what's probably still my favorite story that I've ever done, which is called The $40 Lawyer, which is a series about a rookie public defender in the trenches in the Hillsborough County courthouse, learning what it means to be a lawyer, and in the process, what it means to be an adult. So I got very lucky in that I wound up at places, or gravitated toward places, where this sort of reporting is actually encouraged. And then at the LA Times, you know, one of the great things about our emergence from the horror that we've been facing, because we were headed toward the wood chipper, my friends. We got a new owner and new editors, and one of the great things is that they're reviving something called Column 1, which for years was the showcase piece at our newspaper, and it's coming back to my tremendous delight.
Hi, I'm Leanne Hay, and I write for a nonprofit arts organization, and that in and of itself should tell you what my budget is like. I have been trying to pitch the stories of the artists, not just their work. And I think podcasts are the way to reach out to a more diverse and inclusive customer base or audience base that they want to attract. So can you just give me some very basic analytics of, again, the equipment that you used, as well as, you know, did you have to quantify the return on the investment of resources to the phenomenal results that you got? Did you ever get any feedback on that?
I mean, like I said, $1,000 can get you the equipment that you need, and I'm happy to give you the specific types of things afterward, if you like. But I mean, the real investment is time. The real investment is finding the time, or giving the people that you supervise the time to go and get these interviews and transcribe them, which takes forever, and assemble them in a story. But I think we're out of time, but I'm happy to give you the specifics.